This is Beyond a Reasonable Doubt with your hosts, Mark Garrigus and Gary Smith.
Welcome to the Sunday morning BARD edition. We're here at the altar of BARD. It's been quite a week. For those who watch or listen to us regularly, you know that Gina and Brian launched their new pod, and we had them on Friday. And Gary and I were just talking before this. They've already cracked the top 25 on their pods. So, hey, congratulations, Gary, to you, since you're the EP and the head of podcast operations.
Well, thank you very much, Mark, and congratulations to you as well, you and Ben, for greenlighting the idea. It's onward and upward. I think that it'll be well past the top 25 by the time people start listening to this.
It's fantastic. They found a home, and I hope they decorate it nicely. What's interesting to me this week, obviously, is all the speculation fueled in part by the ex-president himself that Tuesday he was going to get arrested.
Right.
I thought, for those of you who have been faithfully not paying attention to this story, it is all signs point to both coming out of New York, the Manhattan DA's office, that they will indict the president this coming week. I think we talked about, for listeners to the show, once an invitation goes out to the person who's in the crosshairs in the New York State Court. Remember, this is a state court action, and that is a telltale sign that they are at the penultimate stage of asking for an indictment. And there's been a lot of misinformation out there, and so I thought I would at least talk about some of that, and then Gary, maybe we talk about a historical antecedent, although it's not a perfect historical parallel. First of all, this is, as I indicated, it's a state court action. And why does that matter? Well, it matters because I've heard all kinds of nonsense about a president or who the next president is, for instance, or that this case will never go to trial or end potentially in a conviction or even have to go to trial because if the Republicans win, that presidential candidate will pardon him. I've even heard that should be the first question. It's been running rampant on the internet. That should be the first question of any presidential candidate. Yeah. Understand this is a state court case. You cannot, a federal presidential pardon will do nothing for this case, number one. Number two, that also brings up an interesting sideline here. This case has been front and center in both the Southern District and the Federal Elections Commission. And why do I say that? Well, obviously, because Michael Cohen pled in the Southern District guilty. He is a witness to this event and an integral player in the event. And number two, he named in the indictment a co-conspirator who everybody thought was Donald Trump. And here, this would confirm what was referred to in that indictment, and the Southern District did not proceed, but the state is proceeding. So it's kind of a you have to wonder about the timing of this. You'll remember, Gary, we covered that a couple of the prosecutors, and I think we even talked to KFA.
Yeah, we did. Two of them resigned.
They resigned because this wasn't happening. And at some point, Alvin Bragg, it had been reported, had lost interest in this case. Do you remember that? That's why these two, I think Mark Pomerantz was one.
Yep.
I probably, if I'd thought about it, would have called and asked him to come on and ask them about it, come on to Reasonable Doubt. Yeah. But that's interesting to me too. What has changed in the interim to invigorate a probe that two of the guys that were hired to kind of lead this probe from outside of the office resigned in protest. You remember that, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So one of the things that I think has changed is, you may remember, and it didn't get wall-to-wall coverage like obviously this is, but there was a trial in which they had secured first a plea against the gentleman who was the CFO of the Trump organization. Then they went to trial against the Trump organization. Susan Nicholas, I believe, was the lawyer, a very fine lawyer in New York, who tried that case. And they got a conviction against the Trump organization. That was a conviction, as you might remember also, Gary, I had indicated, that had very little consequence. I forget what the fine was, but it was minuscule as opposed to the amount of effort and resources that had gone into this. A lot of the jurors had talked after that. And it's my guess, it's a complete guess because I'm not in the room, but my guess is that emboldened the DA to reinvigorate this matter. And the fact that a lot of the jurors, I don't know that anybody had gauged the animus that people of New York have for Trump in that kind of a setting where you have, you can obviously know just by voting patterns and the scuttlebutt that you hear that New Yorkers have no use for Donald Trump. But when you hear jurors talk about and make comments like they did after that trial, I think that's an interesting take.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you brought up Michael Cohen earlier. Trump's been vocal about him as well on his social media platforms. And there's been quite the back and forth on the social media channels that I've been watching. It's
You have the Truth Social post, because I wanted to comment on that if I could. The Truth Social post by the erstwhile president.
Yeah, one second. I can pull it up right here.
Okay.
But yes, he posted, and it was all caps, is what I saw. And he was very vocal about, let's see here.
Well, the reason I bring this up is because he says he anticipates he'll be arrested on Tuesday. If that were to come to pass, and first of all, I don't know where he would be when he believes they will come arrest him, because they would have to come through Governor DeSantis to get a warrant for, here you go, the Manhattan District Attorney, that's Alvin Bragg, which we were just talking about, blah, 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 new records for crime, George Soros.
Based on an old and fully debunked fairy tale, the far and away left-leaning leading Republican candidate, former president of the United States of America, will be arrested on Tuesday of next week. Protest, take our nation back. That last part's disturbing.
So the arrested on Tuesday would imply, logically at least, that he and his lawyers, and I think he's being represented now by Joe Tacopina in New York, have arranged for a surrender so that he can do what's called a self-surrender, which would mean he would go to Manhattan, and there's several ways you can do it, but would submit himself to an arrest and a booking and presumably a release.
Right.
And there has been pushback against that no arrangements have been made so far. But obviously he has heard something.
There's certainly been speculation on the internet, at least, that the NYPD is preparing for, unrest potentially, and protest. So that's, who knows if that's just the internet.
And to that end, I was just in New York as of yesterday, and people were telling me on Fifth Avenue, you should get out of there. That's not why I'm here in LA today, but yes, that has run rampant. We had played out on Friday with Gina and Brian the idea that there is a kind of a hypothetical situation where he could, and I believe I've seen this also on the internet since we talked about it, Gary. I think Mike Cernovich has posited the same thing yesterday that we were talking about on Friday, is that since this is a state case under the applicable laws of extradition, if he was he, being the ex-president, was at Mar-a-Lago, they would need, in order to extradite him, if he said, I'm not going to cooperate, I'm not coming to New York to self-surrender, they would need to go through, would have to be Governor Hochul would have to sign, would trigger the extradition, which would then go over Governor Ron DeSantis's desk. And people say, well, of course he would extradite. The political calculation, because that's one of his rivals. Trump is his rival for the nomination. And Cernovich had a take on it that, and am I pronouncing his name right? I hope.
I believe so.
That his take on it was kind of more in line with my take on it. And no, when you have as many candidates as there are in this race, that DeSantis signing the extradition would be viewed as almost within the insular Republican Party of the base as kind of a traitorous act, ironically enough. And so I'm not so sure that DeSantis would do that. I think that DeSantis there's a political world where, and by the way, I'm speculating here for those, of course, who will say, well, he ended up surrendering and you said he wouldn't surrender. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that one of the things you do as a defense lawyer, one of the things that I guarantee you, if he's got lawyers who have practiced criminal law, and he does, are considering, is all your options. And one of the options here is to say, no, we're not going to surrender. We do not recognize the jurisdiction. We believe, for a variety of reasons, that the statute of limitations has run. We believe that you have no authority as a state court. And mind you, remember, the DA of Manhattan is in the state system. There will be an argument that federal election laws do not apply, and therefore the expense report, which forms the basis for this, presumably a criminal case, is invalid from the beginning. So there is that argument as well. Now, all of this is notwithstanding all of the arguments about having, you also see on the internet, Joe Biden's Justice Department is doing his dirty work to eliminate a candidate. Well, you can make the argument that Alvin Bragg is a Democrat, and you can make the argument that he's doing this to co-opt a Republican, but this is not being done by the feds. So understand that when you make that accusation. And I think, by the way, why do I bring that up also, besides debunking some of the stuff that we've seen, it also, I think will also play ultimately into, does Georgia indict him in a state case? And remember, we've still got the special prosecutor Jack Smith out there talking about January 6th in the Mar-a-Lago classified records. And even if Jack Smith decides that he wants to indict, he still has to go through Merrick Garland. And those are going to be considerations that Merrick Garland, at that point, when it comes vis-a-vis Jack Smith, will have to make.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's also, there's, you mentioned the stumbling blocks, the expense report and stuff like that. It's, even after we get through all of those, assuming those are all good, we're working on a dicey string of theories that get us to undo election or campaign finance enrichment. It's not the straight line that a lot of people want it to be. I think it'll be fascinating to watch how it plays out, but it's certainly.
Let me tell you, it's a great point, because let me tell you the potential battlefields if they decide they don't want to fight extradition. I don't know that if I were advising him that I would not. Too many double negatives. I think I probably would say, let's give this some serious thought. Let's see how this plays out. You don't believe that this is a valid prosecution. You believe there are complete defenses to this when I'm talking to the client. Sure. You believe that the statute of limitations for one is run. You believe, number two, that the case itself is infirm because, by the way, I think everybody agrees this is a legal theory that's never been tested or blessed by the New York state courts, this theory that they are proceeding on. So if you want to do all of that, well, the governor of the state you live in gets to pass on whether to extradite you. And by the way, while all of that is working its way through the courts, you continue to campaign. There may be a warrant that is issued, but there is a mechanism by which they can challenge that as well, and whether the execution of that warrant, other than in the state of New York. And so I'm not so sure. I've heard people talk about, well, this could inhibit his travel. I don't believe that that's the case. If he were to legitimately, legally fight that out. And by the way, it may also, I don't know that they would get expedited review at every stage. And he is no stranger, he being the ex-president, to litigating matters like this. And I think he's got some valid legal issues that he can raise on all of this, not the least of which is that even on the merits, he's got defenses.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, it would be somewhat fun if he were to come to a blue state and Gavin Newsom decided he was going to send out, you know, the Rangers or the Marshals and have someone try to arrest him. It's just, it seems like, it just seems so improbable, but so has everything about the journey that got us here. You know, and here we are, and, you know, it seems inevitable that the next Beyond a Reasonable Doubt sure should be one not to miss.
Right. And we didn't even get to the historical parallel. Maybe we'll talk about it. I was thinking today, speaking of lawyers, about Abby Lowell, because Abby was the lawyer who represented John Edwards in his case, and I believe back in 2012, where John Edwards was accused of using a very well-known, then at the time, trial lawyer to ferry around the woman who had borne his child to avoid the scrutiny, if you will, during the election.
Right.
And they alleged, the government alleged, and by the way, last time I looked, that was a Democratic democratically appointed DOJ. In fact, Lanny Brewer, who was the assistant AG, is somebody who's a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat. I've spoken to him in the past, and wonderful man. And he was the spokesperson from DOJ. He wasn't the actual on the trial team, but that case ended up, Abby tried that case. It was a hung jury, and the government thereafter decided not to proceed. And why do I mention Abby? Well, obviously the connection here to the historical antecedent, but also interestingly, Abby also just tried not Tom Barak, but the co-defendant, and won that in New York in the Eastern District. And for those of you who are in the weeds on lawyers, was also Jared Kushner's lawyer during many of the Trump administration investigations. So he's clearly known within the administration, and presumably to Trump as well. I would have thought that was a natural pick as a lawyer, but you know, it's Tacopina is an interesting pick. I've always said the state court of New York reminds me of the bar in Star Wars. It's a very unusual place, and I've been in there, but I've had clients who've offered me gobs of money to try cases there, and I always tell them, no, you need to go call Ben Brofman or somebody like Ben who knows how to navigate the state court in New York. In fact, I often said I reported to have said afterwards to Harvey Weinstein that was one of his biggest mistakes, is letting Ben go, because it is a completely different. It's one of the reasons, basically, that I've always taken the position, with a couple of notable exceptions, of not doing state court work. I'll do federal virtually anywhere, but I won't do state court in most other states. And it is compounded exponentially in the New York State Supreme Court, which is their trial court. It's just it's a different culture than you're used to anywhere else in the country.
Yeah, you kind of got to pay for that institutional knowledge and make sure that you have someone who's familiar with the landscape, or you're doing yourself a disservice.
That's exactly right. I couldn't agree more. So we'll wrap it up here. We could talk for a while about this. I thank everybody for listening. I will also encourage you to go listen to Gary's new project with Brian and Gina, the
Yes.
LA Magazine podcast. It was a fascinating story. They had one of the authors who talked about the slot whisperer. Speaking of lawyers, a lawyer who frittered away close to $10 million in money.
Over 10 million.
Over 10 million. Yeah, it's a fascinating story. Michelle McPhee plays it. And I want to thank Alex and Ani for sponsoring us and this episode and the every BARD episode. Go to alexandani.com, especially Mother's Day coming up, or if you've got, like I do, loved ones who have April birthdays. Yeah. It's affordable and meaningful jewelry.
Well, that's where I'll be going. I've got a 5-year anniversary coming up, as well as a birthday for my wife. So alexandani.com, excuse me. And yeah, absolutely. Check it out. Mark, thank you so much for giving us so much of your time on a Sunday morning. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Gary. Good luck to you and Brian and Gina.
Thank you very much. Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to Reasonable Doubt. Subscribe on YouTube at youtube.com/Reasonable Doubt Podcast.